the self.
Well, certainly true in principle that you would think evolutionary psychology, knowledge of your underlying motivation, would give you the opportunity of prevailing over your natural inclinations upon reflection. Are there cases where you have very consciously decided to just go against a genetic imperative? I mean, something that you understand is kind of the natural impulse, but you've taken a stand and...
I hope so.
Nothing you'd care to share with the world.
Yes, right.
Okay. Well,
certainly, I think we do this all the time. I mean, it's the old word for it was wisdom, foresight, appreciating human nature, and people used to get it from literature, religion, observing lessons of history. Yeah. And sometimes it's quite self-conscious. I mean, in the debates over the American Constitution, I mean, those guys were all psychologists, Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and so on, and often they were evolutionary psychologists in a sense. At least they had this element of cynicism toward themselves, and were saying, well, it's great that we're going to overthrow the British, but even though it would be very tempting now to crown ourselves kings, since we know that we're not likely to be infinitely virtuous and wise, maybe we should build into the system something that will protect other people against us, for the same reason that we're now liberating other people from the British. And you have statements from people like Madison and Hamilton that were cynical in exactly the way that evolutionary psychology is, and which led to this terrific thing called democracy.
Well, and religions, as you say, I mean, are full of kind of implicit Darwinian wisdom. I mean, the idea that you find in all kinds of religions that basically boils down to the whole notion of sin, it seems to me, rests partly in the idea that certain types of behaviors are addictive. There's a slippery slope. The idea that extramarital sex is prohibited absolutely, that's the idea behind sin, kind of implicitly recognizes that the more you do it, the more likely you are to keep doing it. And the whole idea of falling. And Buddhist ideas like the idea that the pursuit of pleasure is almost inherently, in a sense, a futile struggle, because happiness is almost kind of designed to evaporate once you reach the various goals you're supposed to reach, because as organisms we're not designed to ever be happy with what we are, really.
No, that's right. Also, in religions in which actually thinking something is sinful, I mean, this is, in one sense, this is completely unrealistic because we have 100 thoughts for every action.
Right.
On the other hand, there is some cognitive psychology behind that, namely, if you think about things, you're going to calculate ways of attaining it. That's what thinking is for.
Right.
And so thought control, for better or worse, will have some probabilistic influence on behavior.
Right. People aren't designed to fantasize just in order to keep fantasizing. They're designed to
Fantasizing
fantasize to make their fantasies real.
Yeah, because there's often very complicated ways of getting what you want, and if you think through all of the causal chains, you're more likely to know how to get what you want in the world.
Right. And what about really one of the more fundamental threats this worldview could pose to morality, which is the idea that even your deepest moral intuitions are suspect?
Yeah.
Taken far enough, and I mean this is part of the idea that, for example, when you feel moral outrage about betrayal, it's a function of reciprocal altruism, which is just something that happened to evolve on a particular planet.
Yeah.
The whole notion that good deeds should be rewarded, bad deeds should be punished. If these don't have some kind of absolute moral standing, the fear is that everything will fall apart.
Right. That we're one step away from nihilism.
Right.
Kind of the Nietzschean idea that there isn't any there, so you may as well take everything.
Now you're probably looking at this in the book you're writing now, too.
Some, yeah, that's right. I think there are a couple of answers. One of them is that even if you think of morality as just something like color vision or our sweet tooth or a stomach ache, it's just a figment of the brain. It is one that evolved in response to a real fact about the universe, namely that in a social species, when people interact, not all codes of behavior are going to lead to outcomes that everyone wants. and that there is a logic to morality that benefits people who simultaneously adopt it compared to them all abjuring it. And that's what your own book, Non-Zero, in large part was about. So there is a kind of, it isn't as arbitrary as responding to light of a certain wavelength. And in some other species, like bees, they can detect ultraviolet light, which we can't, and leading to the fear that our morality, like our vision, is something that arbitrarily could have gone the other way around if our evolutionary history was slightly different. I think this might also tie to a notion that philosophers bat around, which they call moral realism, that there may be a sense in which some moral statements aren't just figments or artifacts of a particular brain wiring, but are part of the reality of the universe, even if you can't touch them and weigh them. In the same way that some mathematicians say, subscribe to mathematical realism, that 1 and 1 equals 2, or the Pythagorean theorem, aren't just things that we concocted as a fantasy. There's a sense in which they're really true, independent of our existence. I mean, they're out there in some sense that's very difficult to grasp, but we discover them, we don't hallucinate them. It's conceivable that moral truths have something of that status, that we discover them. And if so, it would have to be something like that, like this. If I want you to behave in a certain way that will benefit me, and I try to convince you that you should do it, you ought to do it, it's logically impossible for me to maintain that directive to you without accepting it as a directive on myself. Because why?
I mean, just because it won't work, I won't let you get away with it?
Well, you won't let me get away with it, and if I try to justify it by appealing to your intellect, right, there's no way that I can do it unless it's reciprocal.
That's flattering that you think my intellect wouldn't get by.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't take long for someone to say, well, why, that's not fair. Why should I kiss up to you if you don't kiss up to me? Or why should I refrain from stealing from you if you feel perfectly free to steal from me? And so on. Why should I not sleep with your wife if you're perfectly willing to sleep with my wife? And so on. So there is something in the logic of the situation that as soon as you have an iota of rationality, and as soon as you call on someone to do something, as soon as you invoke this strange concept of should or ought, it's got to work its way to certain conclusions, which may be why in all moral systems you have something like the Golden Rule, some version of it, which in a way ties into the logic of reciprocity, namely, it makes sense only if I do it to you and you do it to me as well. And there's something about the interchangeability of people's interests and viewpoints that underlies all of morality, that you couldn't imagine an organism evolving with some part of what we call morality that is not based on that core, at least for it to be recognizable by us as moral, as opposed to having to do with food or sex or color vision. Okay, so it seems you've got two, in some ways, separate ideas floating around here. One is the idea of moral, is it realism? Realism, yeah. The idea that moral truths are kind of out there. So there is an absoluteness to moral truths in the sense that mathematical truths are kind of out there in a Platonic world or something. Yeah. And the other is that the system, I mean, the evolutionary system, I gather, you mean, naturally converges on these truths as a practical matter. That's right. That's exactly right. So here's another analogy. Depth perception is a contingent property of the brains of certain organisms that, and particular kinds of depth perception, like stereo vision, recovering depth from the difference in the views of the two eyes. Right. So it evolved, we have it, fish don't. Many other animals like sheep don't have it because their eyes point sideways instead of straight ahead. So it's because of the particular evolutionary history of primates that we happen to have stereoscopic vision. Mm. But it still taps into some aspect of geometry that was true before we evolved and will always be true. Namely, right, you can just do the Euclidean geometry and figure out that there's information about depth in binocular parallax. So it's a mixture of something that we evolved because it was useful and something that is out there and that pre-existed us. And it could be that there's a logic to morality, that some extraterrestrial or cosmic being could calculate,
right.
even if we never evolved. But we evolved certain circuitry that taps into it and that allows us to grasp these